I began doing this work back in the 1970s when I think it was really difficult to have these conversations. We had organizations that were smearing us, that were distorting what we said, were portraying us as supporters of terrorism, and people got fired from their jobs. People were denied positions. People were threatened. First death threat I got was 1970. My office got firebombed in 1980, and it got worse and worse until Oslo, the first Intifada in Oslo, and then the debate opened up. And when it opened up, there was a reasonable discussion that took place in some quarters about Israel-Palestine. And there were ups and downs in the next 30 years, but for the most part, there was an opportunity to speak. The problem is that as the conversation grew, some groups got threatened by the fact that the conversation was changing and that there was more support for Palestinians, and the smearing and the tarnishing of people's reputations and the firing from jobs, et cetera, started up again. And we're seeing that today in full bloom.
Is that right? And I think that you and I certainly know enough about, or silencing debate, I should say. And while you and I don't normally debate these issues with each other, we tend to be closer alike. I think we both know what it's like to be in these debates and to witness a world where these debates are silent. So this is a great opportunity to be here today to talk to folk about the silencing of dissent. I can't see the audience, but good afternoon to everybody there, everybody, Rainbow Push, everybody who showed up to hear us talk, and we're going to do just that in the 45 minutes that we have. For those that don't know, my name is Marc Lamont Hill. I'm a professor at the City University of New York Graduate Center. I'm also a host at Al Jazeera, and I'm excited to be here. I've been sort of part of this conversation on Israel-Palestine in the United States for a minute now, and I am accompanied by my senior colleague and someone who's been much more deeply and more, I would say, interestingly connected to the struggle for a very long time, Peter Beinart. Peter, maybe we could just start by talking about our relationship to these debates a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm really glad to be able to talk with you. I mean, I think my relationship is different because even though it's not always easy being an American Jew who is critical of Israel and who has actually major questions about the entire idea of a state that privileges Jews over Palestinians, there is still there is still a privilege that exists in the U.S. discourse as a result of being Jewish. And so for me, and it's an unearned privilege, honestly. I mean, I do have a deep stake in this question. It's deeply important to me because I care deeply about the welfare of Jews in Israel and anywhere else, and I care deeply about Palestinians, and because I care deeply about Judaism, and I feel in some ways that actually what happens in Israel-Palestine is a kind of referendum on Judaism itself, but I don't have a deeper investment necessarily than many other people, nor do I necessarily know anymore, right? And yet sometimes I feel like I have this unearned status in the conversation. So for me, the challenge is kind of, how do I use that in a way that helps to create space for other people, so that the situation that Edward Said famously talked about as Palestinians lacking a permission to narrate, how do I use my privilege in order to try to create space for other people? And sometimes, honestly, figuring out the right balance of that is not always simple, but that's something that I think about when it comes to trying to move us in a conversation where there is a greater degree of openness, and when people of goodwill and good conscience, regardless of their background, I want us to get to a place where they can enter into these conversations and share their values and not fear that they're going to be, someone's going to try to ruin their career, which is something you know something about, or someone's going to call them Someone's going to call them an anti-Semite, which is a term that should be used with a certain degree of reverence. It has a power for a reason. It has power because, for most part, because of the suffering of previous generations of Jews. And it seems to me we should treat the power that that term has because of what they went through with a certain kind of with a reverence and with a care. And it really upsets me to see the way in which it's used simply because you want to shut down a debate that you think you might lose on the merits. That seems to me not treating this with the respect and the reverence that it has, this idea of hating Jews. So those are some thoughts that I have. But I'd love to hear about you. You've been through this in some very, very, very difficult ways, and I deeply, deeply admire the way you've conducted yourself throughout it.
Well, I appreciate that. And
Can I just come in for a second? I think you can hear us now. Peter, can you hear us?
There's a little echo.
Okay, I'm going to turn it off, but I just want to know, I want to thank you all for your professionalism for sort of taking this over. We had some technical problems here at Push, but I think we're beyond them now, but I really appreciate the fact, like I said, that you've taken the conversation over, and I want to go to you, Mark, with the question that Peter had for you.
Yeah, thank you. I think, let me start by sort of laying the analysis. I'll talk about myself in a second, but I want to sort of pick up where Peter left off, which is a really interesting place, because he's talked about this idea of anti-Semitism. He's talked about wrestling with the question of whether there should even be a state that privileges Jews over Palestinians. These are questions that are not currently permitted within the debate. Part of how debate is silenced is by establishing and defining terms. If we define terms in particular ways, they don't create room for alternative possibilities, or those alternative possibilities are then constructed as being outside the moral, ethical, legal, or political boundaries of the conversation. So, for example, if we begin by accepting as a premise that Zionism, particularly political Zionism, and there's all sorts of forms of Zionism, and we need to be mindful of that as well. There are people like Peter, I think he would identify as a cultural Zionist. There are people who have a particular understanding of Zionism that isn't dependent upon settler colonialism or various other forms of violence and harm and extraction, etc. But when we talk about Zionism, so if we define self-determination as the right to a Jewish state, and when we say Jewish state, we really mean the right to an ethno-state, a state where people get superior privileges, access, rights, freedoms, etc., by virtue of being Jewish or not Jewish. If we begin from that framework, then everything is going to look like anti-Semitism, because a challenge of Zionism seems like a challenge of Judaism. If Israel is imagined as the physical and political embodiment of Jewish self-determination and of a liberated Jewish people, then any critique of Israel gets seen as a critique of Jewishness. And so while we often say we don't want Israel held to a different standard than everyone else, what we end up doing in this particular discourse is holding Israel to a lower standard. We can critique Saudi Arabia, we can critique Iran, we can critique France, we can critique Uganda, we can critique maybe even us as the United States, but one thing we cannot do is critique Israel. And so this becomes part of how the debate is silenced. We have questions that we take for granted that should not be taken for granted. We for example, we say Israel has the right to exist. That Israel has the right to exist. Nowhere else in the world are nation states' right to exist affirmed in the way that Israel's is. That is to say, no one walks around saying, does France have a right to exist? Does Germany have a right to exist? Does Canada have a right to exist? Does Djibouti have a right to exist? And the language of a right to exist is deliberately vague and ambiguous and ultimately misleading. Because when we say the right to exist, we're not asking about the existential safety of Jewish people. Because if that's the question, then yes, all people have a right to exist. Jewish people certainly have a right to exist. And not just exist, Jewish people have a right to exist with safety, dignity, justice, freedom, and self-determination, just like everybody else. The question of a Jewish state, though, and Israel's right to exist is not about that. It's not about the territorial integrity of the nation, which is what the UN resolutions were initially about after the 1967 war. When we say that Israel's right to exist, what they really mean is the right to exist as a Jewish state. That the right to exist in a way that fundamentally and systematically and necessarily disenfranchises Palestinian people. But we're not allowed to question that. People say Israel has a right to self-defense. We're right now in the International Court of Justice, having concluded 2 days of hearings, the first day being South Africa's, the second day being Israel's defense. And we begin from this premise that Israel has a right to defend itself. Of course, Israel has a right to defend itself. All nation states have a right to defend themselves. But they don't have a right to defend themselves in areas that they occupy. In areas that they occupy. If I'm a part of a military occupation, the land that I'm militarily occupying has a right to defend itself. In other words, when we invade Iraq and occupy Iraq, Iraqis have a right to self-defense, not us. It would be like if I bust in your house and you pulled out a weapon to defend yourself when I robbed your house. I can't then shoot back and say, well, it was just self-defense. Right? The law does not allow the right to self-defense as you're militarily occupying somebody. So even as we talk about what's going on over the last 76 years in terms of what's going on since the formation of Israel, or since the 1967 war, the last 57 years, or since the siege in Gaza began in 2006, right? The last 18 years or 17 years, we have to begin with a different legal analysis. But the media frameworks, the educational frameworks, the legal frameworks that we appeal to don't actually analyze the problem as it should be analyzed. And so what we end up doing is having a framework where we can't question Israeli aggression against Palestinians, lest we be saying Israel can't defend itself. We say that we can't question Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, as an ethnocracy, as an ethno state. Because if we do that, then we're questioning Jewish self-determination, right? We can't refer to it as settler colonialism unless we are denying the very real, longstanding roots of Jewish people in historic Palestine. There's been an uninterrupted presence there. We don't deny that. So the way the debate is narrowed, there's no space to ask the very questions we need to create political change, to create critical political analysis. There's no space for any of that within the present dialogue. And one of the ways that we police that dialogue is by using the language of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the hatred of Jewish people for being Jewish. The hatred of Jewish people for being Jewish. All of the violence, all of the pogroms, all of the tropes, all of the canards, all of the lies, all of the stereotypes, all of this is part of anti-Semitism because it's predicated on a person's Jewishness. But if I critique Israel, I'm critiquing a nation state. But because it's self-defined as a Jewish state, again, I'm seen as anti-Semitic for criticizing Israel. If I question the right to exist as a ethno state, I'm critiquing Jewish self-determination, right? And so the language of anti-Semitism has been weaponized. To Peter's point, it is no longer treated or regarded with the reverence that it should be. Very recently, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance became the dominant definition of anti-Semitism. In other words, no longer do we define anti-Semitism as the hatred of Jewish people for being Jewish. Instead, we've expanded the definition of anti-Semitism. And when I say we, I don't mean me or a lot of other folk, but the Anti-Defamation League adopts this, AIPAC adopts this, and they've attempted to normalize a definition of anti-Semitism that includes critiques of the state of Israel, questioning the formation of Israel as a racist endeavor. They said anything that questions the sort of legitimacy of Israel's formation is itself an act of anti-Semitism. So if I say that Israel is a settler colonial state, that's anti-Semitic by their definition. If I say that Israel is structurally racist because it privileges some identities over other identities, that is considered anti-Semitic. They're not even just saying we disagree and let's have a debate over the policy. Let's debate whether there are really more than 60 laws on the books that discriminate against Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. We can't even have that debate. because the very implication, the very assertion of that claim is defined as anti-Semitism. So if I am definitionally anti-Semitic simply for questioning the terms of debate, then there's no way to change the terms of debate. And the policing of speech and the narrowing of debate and the shutting down of debate isn't just limited to sort of rhetorical space. It's not just limited to conversations we're having or debates we're having in philosophy class or even in policy quarters. It plays out in real life. Do you know how hard it is to run for president without echoing the most troublesome and problematic AIPAC talking points? Too often, you'll have Democrats run for president and you'll have Republicans run for president, and they will disagree on everything, including what time it is, what the temperature is, what they having for dinner. They disagree on all of that. But they all will say, well, Israel has a right to be a Jewish state uninterrupted. They'll say two-state solution is the only way to go, right? They'll say the problem is Hamas and Israel's a democratic state, and if we could just get rid of Hamas, everything would be fine. There's no space for unorthodoxy or a lack of orthodoxy in the political debate on Israel-Palestine. Very few people, like a Cornel West, for example, who can stand up and speak out and still run for the presidency. If you have a radical critique, a principled critique, but a fundamentally disruptive one that changes the way we talk about things, of the relationship between Israel and the United States, or Israeli policy in the United States, etc. If you have any kind of radical policy difference, it can be difficult to get jobs. In places like Texas, states like Texas, and even New York, there have been governors and other legislators, as well as executives like the governor, who have attempted to advance legislation that punishes both corporations and individuals for supporting bans of Israel. So again, there's not just the kind of philosophical limiting of conversation, and there's not just the kind of discursive policing of people's speech through the moral cudgel of anti-Semitism as defined by AIPAC, ADL, and really more fundamentally the IHRA now, but there's also real material penalties. There's a real stake attached to criticizing Israel in certain ways as a commentator. I got fired from CNN for a speech I gave at the United Nations. Now I'm gonna hand this back to Peter now. There are faculty who don't get tenure because they have critiqued Israel, or who have their tenure fundamentally stolen from them. In the case of Stephen Salaita, you know, we have people who have been placed out of the academy because they have a critique of Israel, like Norman Finkelstein. So we see in the university, we see in the business world, we see in the political realm, a lack of space to have certain kinds of conversation or to adopt certain kinds of framework. And so that's how the debate gets policed. So at the end of the day, all we're debating is the kind of liberal Zionist ethno-state Israel is going to be.
Yeah, I think that's I think you're exactly right. You know, and one of the reasons that I think this is ramping up is because there's a recognition that there are forces in society, younger people in particular, who want to raise these more fundamental questions. It's natural for them to raise these fundamental questions. It's natural for Americans who recognize that we're in a struggle here about whether we want to try to move towards to move closer to the idea of a country that treats people equally under the law, or whether we're going to be a white Christian supremacist country, to see that the people who want a white Christian supremacist country in the United States generally really like Israel. They may not always love the Jews in America, but they really like Israel because they see it as a model for the kind of legalized hierarchy they want in the United States. And so it's only pretty natural for people who are fighting against those legalized hierarchies in the United States to think that actually they might want the same kind of principles in Israel-Palestine that they want in the United States. And I think it's the recognition that that debate is emerging from the ground up that's leading to these really kind of thuggish efforts, and often these kind of alliances that are being made by American Jewish organizations, that establishment American Jewish organizations that want to basically render any critique of Jewish statehood as illegitimate. And I think that there's a recognition that their best allies in doing that will be the same people who are trying to render illegitimate critiques of kind of white or male kind of hierarchy and domination in the United States. So that's why you have Ron DeSantis. Why it's not entirely coincidental that it's Ron DeSantis who's the first guy to ban all the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter. He had just gotten finished banning basically any discussion of Black history, right? It's not, those things come together, and then that at least Stefanik would be doing this, right? And this is, I mean, the problem for these organizations, I think, is on the one hand, they want to claim that they are liberals, whatever that means, progressives in good standing, right? At the very moment that they also want to basically maintain impunity for an Israel that is acting in the like most profoundly illiberal ways, but actually their strongest allies in that effort are going to be people who make no pretense of calling themselves liberals at all. And I think that one of the kind of traumas for certain folks in the American Jewish community is that there has been a very long time in American history where you could call yourself a liberal or a progressive and basically be a virtually unconditional supporter of the state of Israel, certainly believe in the idea of Jewish statehood, and not run into much flack for that, right? And it was possible to do that in large measure because Palestinian voices were silent. Once Palestinian voices enter the conversation and progressives start listening to Palestinians more, people start asking much harder questions about whether, in fact, it's morally or ideologically consistent, right, to take a position in which you support equality under the law in the United States, but you maintain Jewish supremacy in the United States. And so we're seeing this transformation happen in blue spaces and in progressive spaces. And what I would say to people, folks in the Jewish community who find those conversations uncomfortable is, I thought we were telling people that uncomfortable conversations were good, right? That like the point of education is to be challenged, to hear perspectives that are different and unsettling from the ones that you grew up with, right? Like that's what a lot of people that have been saying for a long time. But so like let's accept that and have these debates rather than trying to kind of shut them down, which I fear is, again, not just a threat to pro-Palestinian free speech, but is part of a generalized effort, which is going to extend far beyond Palestinian free speech and is going to extend to the free speech rights of a whole group of people who are saying things that might make kind of certain groups of people who are powerful in America.
Peter, can you hear us, Peter?
As an American Jew talking about these issues.
Thank you, Mark and Peter. Take it over.
Listen, I want to go to Reverend Haynes for a minute. I want to get back to both of you for a second, but I want to ask Reverend Haynes, talk about uncomfortable conversations and having them. We're doing that today and tomorrow, and frankly, I'm hearing things that create an opportunity for an opening of conversation that we have not had in progressive circles. I mean, people have talked about it, people have written about it, but we've brought together 13 national organizations, interfaith, multiple diverse ethnic and racial communities, and we're talking about stuff that have not been talked about in our societies before. This is a bold step for Push. Tell me about how you react to that.
I react to it by saying this sets the stage for healing. This, as they say in the streets when they're protesting, this is what democracy looks like, the allowance of free speech. It is also a motto, and please let me go here, for perhaps what needs to be done in Christian circles, where in too many instances, on the chocolate side of town, Dr. West, black churches and black preachers have been sadly silent while watching the atrocities going on in the Middle East. Number one, because of the fact that the debate has been defined by those who would demonize some while sympathizing with others. And of course, we see that on the news. We see that in terms of how the Palestinians have been defined. We've heard the ugly names that they have been referenced by, but getting specifically down with the church right now. Too many of my colleagues have been silent because they have been baptized in a white evangelical theology that is toxic, that is poisonous, and basically equates what is going on right now with setting the stage for the return of Jesus. That's a dangerous theology. It's a toxic theology. It's a demonic theology. Because I want to say to my beloved colleagues, again, on the chocolate side of town in the black church, who are deviating from the liberative tradition of the black church, the liberation theology of the black church. You're deviating from that, and I simply say, let's go back to your Bible and read the text that says God so loved the world. It does not say God so loved the world except for Palestinians. It says God so loved the world. Let's go back to the biblical text and all of a sudden discover that that Jesus said more about what we do for the poor than what he said about salvation. Let's go back to the biblical text that said, in the Hebrew Bible, for example, God is more concerned with justice than praise and sacrificial offerings. If you don't get that in your theology, then the sad reality is the same white Jesus that has been held for black people in terms of supporting slavery, sanctioning and setting a model for what Jim and Jane Crow segregation ought to look at, like that same white Jesus is now making you hush and quiet in the face of suffering that is going on. And I got to go back to that Jesus, that Palestinian Jew, that dark-skinned Palestinian Jew who said in the judgment, God is going to judge us by how we treat the least of these. And so it says, and don't miss this, God is going to separate the sheep from the goats, the nations, and say, I was hungry, did you feed me? Thirsty, did you give me drink? In prison, did you come see about me? A stranger, did you visit me? Freddie Haynes remix it. I was hungry, but you cut aid, humanitarian aid to children, women, and men in Palestine. I was thirsty, and you contaminated the water. I was in prison because of your prison industrial complex. As a matter of fact, I was in an open air prison in Palestine, and you did not come see about me. And I was trying to exit Gaza during the bombing, but you cut off the border and would not let me go. You can go to hell. And folk gonna say, Jesus, when did we do that? Inasmuch as you did it to the least of these, my sisters and brothers, even those in Palestine where I was born in Bethlehem, homeless, you were doing it also under me, and you can go to hell. And that is the danger, my beloved chocolate black church brothers and sisters who are silent on this, and that is Jesus wants to know where we stand, and are we more concerned with being non-prophetic so we get funded in our non-profit?
I want to thank you. I want to go to Peter for a second. No more. Okay. I'm going to go to Maya for a second. I just want to make an observation that I made in the beginning, but I don't know if people heard it then. Just let me say this. What you're talking about, we had a candidate for president just the other day talk about slavery. Or not talk about slavery, actually not mention slavery. She was talking about democracy. And so you had racists who are Democrats saying that they're Democrats. And I always used to argue that, I remember Nixon, the chief of staff, the general who was in charge of the military, said horrible things about Jews, and yet was all for Israel and got off the hook. These were the anti-Semites for Israel. And unfortunately, that's the reality that we're dealing with. Is on the right, you have anti-Semites who support Israel and so get a pass. But when progressives raise the moral challenge of what's happening to Palestinians, then they're called anti-Semites. And so ADL focuses on the left, but doesn't focus on the right. And the real threat comes from the right. And I think that point's just being made so clearly by all. Maya, do you want to?
I'm grateful that you had to speak words after Reverend Haynes before it came to me. Reverend Haynes, thank you. He had to catch a flight, but we want to thank him again for the incredible leadership. Both Peter and Mark and Reverend Haynes and Jim have invoked the importance of democracy. And I think it's impossible to be an American today and not to talk about the issue of democracy and the wellness of our democracy. It's perfectly appropriate at this gathering, perfectly appropriate at every gathering. But I want us to just take one step back a little bit. And Jim mentioned this when he talked about the history for my community, for Arab Americans. Jim's told this story, so I'll just mention it. His mom, he said, used to tell him, you could have been anything and you would have been fine, but you had to be an Arab American who also wanted to engage in politics. You had to be an Arab American who wanted to advocate for Palestinian human rights. And I have to tell you, my institution, the Arab American Institute, that was co-founded by Jim Zogby and 4 other amazing people, created this institution and coined a term, the politics of exclusion. We were allowed to be Arab American. We were allowed to potentially celebrate our ethnicity. I say potentially, I gotta qualify it. Things are a little rough right now. But we had to do it in a way that checked our deep connection to the human rights issues of the region. First and foremost, the liberation of Palestine. And because our political participation was shut down, this institution was formed to say, Arab Americans are gonna run for office, they're gonna run for president of the United States, they're gonna serve on school boards, they're gonna do everything they need to do, and they're going to talk about Palestinian human rights. And we made some pretty significant progress. I'm not generally, rays of sunshine, break it all down that way. But we made pretty significant progress, which is why, prior to October 7th, we've been dealing for a very long time. Since 2018, the first time Congress introduced a resolution that said we ought to adopt a definition of anti-Semitism that includes the criticism of the State of Israel. It would come up in Congress, and folks like the ACLU would say, you all do what you need to do politically, but there's this wonderful thing called the First Amendment, and you can't pass it. And they wouldn't pass it, but folks would do their politics. When we talk about the state of our democracy today, let's look at the institutions today. Look at the state of our media. Mark talked about his departure from CNN because of a statement about Palestine. Let's talk about people appearing on networks and boasting that I'm going to shut down the debate taking place on this network because I don't like the way it talks about Palestinian human rights. Let's talk about newspapers telling reporters, this is language we use, this is language we don't use. In America, folks, because it's about Palestinian human rights. Let's talk about Congress. Not particularly great in terms of profiles of courage generally, but I can't remember the last time that a member of Congress called for a ceasefire and had a Democratic White House say that that was repugnant. Let's talk about college campuses, where we've been fighting the conflation of the very real problem of anti-Semitism. See, that's the thing, folks. One of the biggest dangers of all of this is we have a real problem of increase in hate in this country. We saw it with the beginning of the 2016 presidential race. From 2016 on, we do a great deal of work at the Arab American Institute related to hate crime and data monitoring. From 2016 on, there has been an increase in hate crime in this country, and that's official data. I'm not going to give you anecdotal information that includes information about a group of students showed a documentary about the Nakba. That is not anti-Semitism, folks. That's why we cannot cite that data. We can cite official FBI data, which tells us there's been an increase in hate significantly every single year. We have been breaking the record 3 years in a row. We don't want to break a record on hate crime 3 years in a row, but that's what's been happening. So we've seen a very real increase in anti-Black racism, always the #1 category in race. We've seen real increase in anti-Semitism, always the #1 category in religion. I would say more about anti-Arab hate, but folks, the erasure of my community means the data sucks, and I can't really share that. I shouldn't say that from the stage, but there you go. The point is, we have real increase in hate that's happening, and it's not the same thing as brilliant young people on college campus saying, there's an injustice here, I'm gonna speak to it, I'm gonna organize, and I'm gonna work to advocate for Palestinian human rights. Those are not the same things. And part of the real danger when we engage in this process is we move away from the need to actually combat the real hate that exists. And that's a huge, huge problem. So if our democracy is failing us in some very real ways, and we have McCarthyism now, folks. We have the congressional hearings just like we saw before. We have university presidents fired because they couldn't answer a simple question by saying, of course genocide is wrong, calling for genocide is wrong, but no one on my campus is calling for genocide. It's not hard. That didn't happen. So here we are, trying to say that if we are going to advance this conversation and help save our democracy, because I think it was Marc who said, the folks that are shutting down this debate, they are the ones that went after critical race theory. They are the ones that have gone after LGBTQ textbooks. There is a very real desire to say, this country can't look like us in this room. But it does, and it will. And we have to fight like hell to make sure that our elected officials, that our government, that our media outlets, that our universities, that our local city councils cannot shut down this debate because it's too valuable to happen. You all called it the politics of exclusion, and we made great progress. And now, last week, we had a university cancel an art exhibit by a Palestinian artist, a brilliant Palestinian artist who does incredible abstract work. Palestinian art has to get canceled now.
Let me just go back to the point I made in the beginning about how we had spent a decade after the first Intifada in Oslo, where the debate opened up, and I think that they got frightened that it opened up, and they had to shut it down. And what this intense reaction to is the fact of the need to shut it down. We can't let it get shut down. We can't let it get shut down. I was thinking, as we were talking about King, that 1983, the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington, I was invited to be on the National Steering Committee of the March. And 3 Jewish groups said, if you let the Arabs in, we're out. They can't be in. And it was Reverend Jesse Jackson who fought for us, and we stayed in. And we had a role in that march because Reverend Jackson said we would be in. And we had never been involved in a presidential campaign before. He came to me in 1983, later that year, and he said, I'm running for president. I want you to be a deputy campaign manager with me. And I said, Reverend, I've been organizing my community for the last 4 years to empower them. I can't give that up. He said, we're going to do more for your community in the next 4 months than you've been able to do in the last 4 years. And he was right, because when I saw the reaction of Arab Americans, for the first time having a candidate come to them and ask them for support and ask them to vote and ask them to be a part of it, they got so excited. We actually formed the Institute based on the experience we had in the '84 Jackson campaign. And I remember early on in the campaign, a whole group of Jewish folks in Washington, organizations, came to see him and said, you got to get Zogby out of there. If he's in your campaign, you're never going to get support from us. And he told him to go walk, but he was in no uncertain terms. He and Jack Odell, who was with him, who was just a marvelous, marvelous human being, passed away short time ago, just a remarkable person. I remember getting so frustrated, I said to Reverend, I said, this just keeps happening, and sometimes I feel like I want to quit, and I'll never forget what he said. He said, if you quit, you give them what they want. What they're most afraid of is that you'll stick around and fight. And so I, just a personal note, I owe so much to him and his courage and his inspiration to us all. But the fact that when we were doing this session on opening the debate, on talking about ceasefire, this was the logical place to be, to partner with PUSH, because the legacy of King, the legacy of Reverend Jackson, is that we fight like justice, we fight like hell, and we don't let anybody get in the way of the demand for justice and of our right to seek it. And so with that, we're going to end this session, and we will come back in just a few minutes with a discussion with Dr. West about, rather appropriately, it's called Responding to a Moral Crisis in Leadership. If you can even put those words together, moral and leadership in this country, you really got something going for you, right? So we're going to try to figure out how we do that. But thank you so much for being with us, and we'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Thank you.